So, we have been looking at 2 Peter for some time now, and we're going to continue to do that today, which I guess that's no surprise to anyone, but I guess I'm going to get this thing here. So, last week we began looking at this passage in 2 Peter chapter 2, where he uses a lot of the same language or very similar metaphors to the ones that Jude uses, talking about the people who are these false teachers, and associates them with first and foremost with things that are useless. Springs without water, mist driven by a storm, for whom the black currents of it are useless and directionless, or at least purposeless, I should say. And he says that they speak out arrogant words of vanity, and they entice by fleshly desires, by sensuality, those who barely escape from the ones who live in error. What that would suggest to me is the notion that they're enticing the people who just barely made it out of the world and came to understand the gospel. And now that they're in the gospel, they're still kind of vulnerable because of their difficulties in understanding that. And now they're being pulled back in because they're promised them freedom while they themselves are slaves of corruption, freedom of greater knowledge, freedom of greater understanding. For by what a man is overcome, by this he is enslaved. And that's an idea that goes back to something Jesus said. But I'm getting ahead of myself because we're going to break this down in here. So we already talked about this, springs without water, and the idea that Jesus is a wellspring of water that is eternal, and that is a wellspring of water to eternal life. And so the big difference that we see here is that true doctrine, true teachings get us closer to and more immersed in that wellspring of life. Whereas false doctrines and false teachings get us further away from it, and they have the appearance of something that is valuable, but underneath it there's really nothing there. And you think about how many people go looking for some kind of spirituality, and what they find is something that's very shallow and very trite in a lot of ways, whether it's through, what we've been talking about quite a lot, televangelists and people like that who are teaching a gospel that's not really a gospel, it's just kind of a self-help dressed up in the Bible a little bit, or whether it's other kinds of spiritual and philosophical teaching either from other religions, or even more commonly today, you have these kind of New Age, the God is in all of us, and the universe is in all of us, and we're all tied in together, and that's how you understand your spirituality. And because people, I think, are stretching for something spiritual, they're vulnerable to this idea that if I come a hold of something, and it makes me feel good, then I must have reached what I was looking for. Because they have a sense of emptiness, they have a sense of something missing, and so when that's filled, rather than asking the question, what has that been filled by, they are simply saying, well, good now, all right, here we go. And it reminds me, my brain is going off in two different tangents here. One of the things it reminds me of is what Jesus talks about with the parable of the woman that's got the demon. And the demon is cast out, but because nothing replaces that, the demon goes and gets some friends and comes back and, sets up house again. And so just looking for something that's, spiritual is a good start, but it's not a good ending necessarily if you don't look in the right place. And if you can't discern between what's true and what's just nice sounding. And of course, because we do tend to look for things that make us happy, a lot of times the things that we find don't have God in them, because God isn't always about making us happy. God is about the larger plan for the universe, and sometimes that means we have to do some things we don't like, whether it's obedience or whether it's trial or whatever it might be. So that's where we kind of run into this problem. Okay, so any comments on that before we move on? All right, so we also, actually we didn't talk about this yet, the springs without water aspect of it. Jesus tells a parable about a man, actually we did, we got this one too, so the idea of something that doesn't produce fruit, and when we talk about false prophets, that's what we're really looking for. Now it's important to understand, false prophets, it's not that they necessarily lack for people who follow them. So if you think about fruit in terms of how many people are converting or doing what you tell them to, that doesn't necessarily speak very much to whether somebody's a false prophet, because you look in Israel at the prophets of Baal and Asher, and they had almost all of Israel was behind them. There were a few thousand that God had reserved out of all of Israel. So obviously the numbers wasn't the relevant thing. And Jesus says, that it's narrow, the way that leads to eternity. So when we think about it in those terms, we need to recognize that production or fruit is godly followers. It is people who are actual followers of God, not just people who are along for the ride. As Jesus says, you are all following me because I'm feeding you. And if I take the feeding you out of it and I make the teaching harder, you're all going to leave. And sure enough, most of them left. As soon as he started teaching something harder, and they understood that they weren't always going to get a free meal when they were around him. So when we think about true fruit, it isn't just a question of, do we got lots of people? Do we have lots of people listening to us? Do we have lots of people showing up? The question about true fruit is, do we have lots of disciples? Are we creating more disciples, or are we creating just a bunch of people who like to hear what we say and like the coffee that we serve before church and that kind of stuff? And I think that the difference between those things is pretty critical for us to be able to understand. Okay, and we also talked about this one, the idea of being double-minded and kind of unstable and not having direction. And one of the problems with false doctrine is that it doesn't really give us meaningful direction. It gives us a sense of movement, but movement by itself isn't necessarily very useful. You're just going in one way or another, but unless you're going towards God, you're not really moving in a useful direction. Okay, so finally, this is where we're supposed to be going to. So the thing that Peter says is that these people, these men, these false teachers, they promise freedom while they themselves are slaves of corruption. In other words, they're going around saying, here's freedom, here's how you get past the entry-level Christianity and you learn how to be more than that. And the truth is that they don't have any freedom at all to offer because they are enslaved to their own desires. And when we look at the Pharisees, we don't think about it in these terms because the Pharisees were very precise in their righteousness. A Pharisee would rarely have been thought of as being a slave to sexual immorality or something like that. And indeed, that would probably be an inaccurate description of them. But it's very much true that Pharisees were slaves to their own corruption, because what they had done is corrupted the law of Moses and turned it into something that was a tool for them to use to gain power, to gain wealth, and to gain respect, basically. And so Jesus in Matthew chapter 23, when he speaks to the crowds and his disciples, he says, the scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore, all that they tell you to do and observe, and do not do according to their deeds, for they say things and do not do them. They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger. In other words, they make all these complicated and difficult laws, but they don't do anything to help people actually fulfill those laws. And indeed, it's true that they were making those laws. It's not just that they were telling people, here's what the law of Moses says. They were saying, here's what the law of Moses says, and here's the additional information that you need to have to understand how to apply the law of Moses. And oh yes, you are expected to follow this too. So when Jesus speaks to the scribes and the Pharisees, he says, you're hypocrites because you travel on sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. Today, I think we would be less likely to fall in with people who are teaching a version of Christianity that basically dispenses with a lot of the moral expectations. At least those of us in a church like this one. We're not likely to look at somebody like Joel Osteen and go, oh yeah, that dude is dead on with everything he's saying, he's not missing anything. We can see what's missing there, or at least we have a sense of what's missing there. Somebody were to come in and say, you know what, the whole thing about Christianity, there's some additional information you need to have, and once you get it, you'll realize that you don't really have to follow the rules on sexual morality. You don't really have to follow the rules on trying to be discerning in what you do and stuff like that. We would look at that and go, yeah, you get out. You don't really know what you're talking about. That's not right. But when somebody comes in and says, we need to be really careful not to do something like that because that gets us too close to something like this, the Church of Christ are likely to say, that's probably right. We should probably not do that. And it's okay if you say that in the sense of, this is the better thing to do. We should avoid this because it can lead into this. That's fine. But whenever you start saying, we can't do this because it would lead to that, And this, there's nothing in the scriptures that say you can't do this, and there's things that say you can't do that. Now you've made a new rule. And now you have become corrupt, not because you're trying to be corrupt, but because you're adding to the Word of God. And there's very few ways to get God more upset than saying that he said something he didn't say.
I was just thinking about Paul's comments in Romans that you become slave to sin.
Yes.
That's the same comment.
And the idea of slaves to corruption is slaves to sin. The dangerous part of this, and it's funny because I didn't realize we were at this point, but this is what my sermon is about today too. So I don't want to go too far down this road on the one hand, but it's a really interesting topic. The problem with corruption when it comes from within the church is that it's much harder to spot, because it usually is dressed up in the trappings of what we all agree on and what we're all trying to do. We're trying to do the right thing, so we need to do this.
Hermeneutics.
Yes, well, hermeneutics and doctrine and however you want to look at it. The danger with corruption for us in the church is less about being corrupted by the world, although that is always something, especially in our world, that is always something we have to be mindful of. It's much more about the tendency to be corrupted by the desire to create our own version of what God wants us to do, and to create our own set of rules, and whether those rules are more harsh or whether they are lighter. And of course it tends to be a mixture of them, right? It's more harsh where it's things that I don't like, and it's more liberal when it's things that I want to do. And so we find ways to justify in both directions, and we have to be very careful about that, because in doing that we exclude some who otherwise should be able to come in, like these proselytes the Pharisees are bringing in, or I shouldn't say that they're the ones that they're keeping out, and then on the other hand we bring other ones in and we mislead them, and then they end up being just as lost as if they'd never been brought in. And at least back when they were lost and they had that sense that there was something missing, they were still looking for the truth. But once they stop looking for the truth, it's pretty much all over at that point. You know, it's kind of like you're trying to find food, and at some point you just get so hungry you can't go on anymore, and once that happens, you're pretty much done. So this is the danger. He also says, Jesus on the other hand says, here's what it really looks like. Here's what actual freedom looks like. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest, which sounds great. And then he says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. Well, wait a minute, how am I supposed to find rest if you're giving me a burden, a work to do? But he says, I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And it sure seems like, when we think about it in the way that we've been taught to think by the world we live in, that it doesn't seem like Jesus' yoke is particularly easy, that his burden is particularly light. Because it's, there's a lot of, giving ourselves up, and there's, service, and there's forgiveness, and there's all these different things that we're expected to do, that the disciples do, and we say, well, how could it possibly be that his yoke is easy and his burden is light? And that's the question I want to throw open to you guys now, is when Jesus says that, what does he mean by that? How is that true? And since he said it all in one sitting, it's not like he said one thing and then forgot what he was saying and said something else over here. It would be like me getting up here and telling you that, a little bit about the Trinity, and then saying that there isn't, that there's really just the Father and there's nothing else. It'd be inherently contradictory. So what does he say? What does he mean by this?
It's an attitude. It's a knowledge of. There's a scripture in Exodus that says, wisdom is the knowledge of God, understanding is basically the knowledge of evil. And it's an attitude of recognizing God and the faith in him being faithful and doing what he says that it will do. And in the short term as well as the long term, being faithful. And looking at it from a daily basis and exercising faith. And that to me is the answer to that.
I don't disagree with anything you said. I'm just not sure how to tie that into the idea of this yoke being light or the burden being easy, where I refer to.
Well, again, I think it's a matter of what is important. If you're if you are constantly berated internally with the desire to follow the flesh, then God's plan is going to be a burden. If you're not, if you've given that up and you are responsible to God's requirements, and that's what your heart is set on, then you just do what God wants you to do.
Okay, so in that situation, so in that case, it sounds like what you're talking about is the idea that if you're aligned with God's purpose, then, and you're not struggling against it, then a lot of the strife goes away.
Yes.
Okay, Steve.
Obviously, this is a metaphor for being under control of something through an apparatus. And so if you're a bad Hindu and you're reincarnated as an ox, you're going to end up having a yoke and a burden and, yeah, okay. So, to me, what this means is that if we surrender to the control of Christ, where we are put under control of Him, okay? So the yoke and the burden, then He's the one driving our lives. Then it's going to be easier, better, by comparison to doing it another way. So where we struggle, I think, is when we bring in the whole idea that being a Christian is a burden, okay? Or being a Christian means you have to give up, all the fun things. That is really a bad way to teach. And the verse up here in verse 20, Matthew 23, are we scribes, Pharisees, and hypocrites metaphorically? And when we go out to proselyte and bring in someone to become a Christian, do we teach them all of the negativity of Christianity, the pharisaical law-keeping ideas of Christianity, and make them worse than they were before they became a Christian? I think it's very comparative scriptures, really.
That's a good point. Anybody else? So I think these are really good points, and I think that's the core. I think the core we have to begin with is humanity. On the one hand, we know that we look forward to vacations. I'm on a 2-week vacation. I'm very glad I'm on a 2-week vacation because the last quarter has been long, and towards the end of it, I was getting really tired of some of the stuff that my students were doing, and so I'm glad to have a couple of weeks away from them so I can go back and hopefully be in a little bit better place, and they can too, hopefully. But even though we enjoy our vacations, we also know that we're not built to not do anything. We're not built to be on vacation all the time. One of the most fascinating studies, and there's a number of different studies that show, one of the most fascinating results of a number of different studies shows that when men especially, who have been working for their whole lives, retire, they die very quickly unless they find something else to do with their time. Because the lack of purpose is very problematic. And when we look even at Adam and Eve, who are literally living in paradise before the fall, they're given a job. What's their job?
Tend
to the garden. God didn't put them in the garden and say, all right, you know what, just eat whatever you want to and sleep whenever you want to and do whatever you want to. He gave them one rule, don't eat from the tree, but he also said, tend the garden. That's your job. Now, I don't know what that involved. We know it couldn't have been real hard because, or it could have been real hard because later on God says to Adam that the ground is now going to be against you. So we know that what we do now when it comes to gardening and tending and growing food, that's what hard looks like. Whatever they were doing looked easy, but nevertheless there was a purpose for them. There was something for them to do in the garden. So man was not created to simply lounge around and not do anything. And so as much as we might enjoy our vacations, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, the simple fact is that the notion that our religion, our faith, should be disconnected from doing something, from having a purpose and living in a way that is active and is fulfilling what God wants is nonsense. It wouldn't make any sense, because that would say that what we can see on the most basic level from social scientists about how humans react to not having a purpose, that somehow that doesn't apply in the spiritual realm. And more often than not, the things that we see going on in the physical realm are amplified in the spiritual realm. So clearly, the idea that religion or faith should be without any hindrances, without any challenges, is not something that we see in the scriptures, and indeed, it's not something we see in any of the larger international religions. You don't see that from any of them. There's always this expectation of doing, of acting, of making hard choices, of making sacrifices. And so, really the question is, what are you making your sacrifices for? Because almost nobody lives a life where everything always goes the way they want it to. And if they do, they usually have very little understanding of how the world works. Most people are constantly fighting against something, whether it's their own mortality, or whether it's poverty, or whether it's sickness, or whether it's family issues, or whatever it might be. There's a constant struggle. And the question, I think, as both of you said, is number one, how do you understand that struggle? Do we see that the struggle is real, whether we want it to be or not? And who are we letting guide us through that struggle? And if we're understanding that there's a struggle no matter who you are, and we have faith that God knows the path through, then it becomes a lot easier to say, okay, let me line up with Him and follow His direction and go where He wants to go, and then it gets easier. And also because, and this is not an insignificant point, if you've got God on your side, you've got a big advantage when it comes to the difficulties that the world throws at you. All right, Jerry, go ahead.
I don't think you can, Paul makes a comment that, his flesh, he had to constantly fight against it. And that the spirit was what he wanted, but the flesh was a constant battle. And I think you can't give up. You can't overlook the flesh and the import and what the flesh does to you. I think that's part of being successful in serving God, is recognizing the flesh's input in your life.
Yeah.
And the burden that becomes less is when you recognize how you can overcome that flesh and be able to recognize that, hey, I can do this.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we have to have an understanding of why we're doing what we're doing before we can understand how to stop doing it. But you're right, ultimately it's not us that's going to make that decision, or it's not us that's going to be able to overcome in that way.
Attitude is so important, and that's what I think we're talking about here. I've taught children to swim since I was 14, and I'm talking 2- and 3-year-olds. And when I was down in Douglas, we had an Olympic-sized pool. We had 2 low dives and a high dive. And every day at the end of class, we would go down and you'd go off the low dive. I would be in the water, somebody would drop the children to me until they had the confidence to do it themselves. And I used to tell the kids, okay, now we got to go off the diving boards, and then all slumped down there. And one day I thought, that's not right. So I just, same class, the very next day I said, okay, now we get to go off the diving boards, and everybody skipped down there. And it's just a matter of how you look at it.
That's true.
And I told that story to Nicole Dudley. And she will tell me to this very day, my boys never had to unload the dishwasher, they got to. And it's a way of looking at things. So if we look at being in the Lord as a blessing, and we get to be with the Lord, the burden is much, much lighter.
Yeah.
Because the world will frown upon us, but that's okay because we've got God.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that for a second there I had this great point about how that tied into what Steve was saying, but now I lost it. This is unfortunate. It was right there, but
Good point.
Yeah, thank you. It was going to be really good. So, but the idea, but attitude is really important, and how we think about what we're doing does affect that. And yeah, when you're raised with the mindset of we have to do this and we have to go to church, you become resentful. And people, generally speaking, when you tell them they have to do something, at least Americans, I shouldn't say all people, you tell Chinese they have to do something, they're like, when? They didn't, but because they have a society that says that's what you do. But we live in a society that is built around the concept of revolution. I hate to say that, but it's built into the Constitution. If a government is oppressive of its people, the right of the people is to alter or abolish it. When you start off with the idea that if you don't like something the way something is, you can overthrow it. It gets really hard to build a mindset of we should do what we're told to do. So whenever somebody says you got to do this, our first reaction is, well, why do I have to do that? You know, I don't. You can't tell me what to do. You know, and so when we start with that mindset, then yeah, we're constantly fighting against the yoke, and we're constantly fighting against what God wants. But you're right, when we come to it from the standpoint of you get to do this, and you get to have a relationship with God, and you get to be, and this is the one that I think I always come back to, when it comes to the morality aspect of it. We can either characterize this in the context of, I have to do the right thing, or we can recognize the amazing God, Scriptures say, which is that only with God do you even have the choice to do the right thing. We get to choose to do the right thing because we have the Spirit dwelling in us. Without the Spirit dwelling in us, we don't have that ability. Because the flesh is driving us, and even though you make some choices that are good, it's more just the whims of the flesh. But you can only consistently choose to do what's right if the Spirit's living. So it is a privilege rather than a burden from that standpoint. That doesn't mean that there isn't a burden involved. Certainly in this life, we understand that there's going to be more challenges for us than for the average person, in at least some respects, because the world is against us. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't at all mean that it's a worse life in this life. And even if it is, the next life is what we're really concerned about. So, okay, let me move on to the next one here. So Peter says, by what a man is overcome, by this he is enslaved. Now, I jumped ahead because the verse is up there automatically, but what I think is interesting is that Paul says, don't be overcome by evil, overcome evil with good. In other words, if you're overcome by evil, or if you use evil as the tool for making things good, you are ultimately enslaved by evil. And anything you do that might look good is going to be tainted to some extent or another by that evil that comes along with it. But if we overcome with good, then we are not enslaved by evil, and we are instead servants of righteousness. So Jesus says, these things I have spoken to you, so that in me you may have peace. In the world you have tribulation. Go back to the point I just made. But take courage, I have overcome the world. Now, to be clear, we don't necessarily read this verse in the opposite of, by what a man overcomes is enslaved to him. That's not the point of this. What the Scripture is saying is that what control, or what overcomes us, what we choose to submit to, we're enslaved to that. It doesn't necessarily mean that if we gain control over that, or if we overcome that problem, that now that has enslaved us. That would be a mistaken way of thinking. And in fact, that's exactly the problem, or at least a big part of the problem with the Gnostics. They're saying, Jesus has overcome the flesh. Jesus has overcome the sin, so we can do whatever we want to. It's overcome, so we can do whatever we want to. That's not the correct way to understand it. That is warping what's being said there. We're not the ones in control of the world. God is ultimately in control of the world, but the control of the world in the immediate sense lies in the hands of Satan. And so to ever think that we should approach the world with anything other than caution is a severe misunderstanding of our actual relationship with the world. Now, we approach it with righteous caution, we approach it enthusiastically, going out to reach the lost. We do all those things, but we never forget that when we're around the world, when we are in the world, that the world is always looking to make us, either to make us suffer for being Christians, or even more often, to try to make us turn away from our faith and to make bad choices. Similarly, in 1 John, picking up from Jesus' teaching, says, for whatever is born of God overcomes the world, and this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. And again, we're not talking about it in the sense of, and now I can get the word to do whatever I want it to do. What we're saying is, you've overcome the world in the sense that the world no longer has mastery and dominion over you. You're under the dominion of Jesus now. So we don't think about this lightly. We don't think in terms of, well, I can do whatever I want to. We think in terms of, I do whatever my master wants me to do. And if we understand it that way, things get a lot easier. So in Romans, Paul says it this way. I think, Jerry, this is something you were referencing earlier. Paul says, do you not know that when you present yourselves to someone as slaves for obedience, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin resulting in death or of obedience resulting in righteousness? Now, the first part of that, actually, what he's really saying is, obviously everybody understands that if you present yourself to someone for slaves to obedience, then you're slaves of the one you obey. So what he's really saying is this is something everybody understands. It's kind of a parable in a simplified version. Everybody understands this. Now you need to apply that principle to spiritual things and recognize that when you present yourself as a slave of obedience, you become a slave of either righteousness or of sin and death.
A few verses down from that context, Paul says that it's not easy, that I myself have, buffet my body daily, that I not be a castaway. He's telling you how to do it, but he recognizes that it has difficulties involved.
Yeah, and depending on the person and the context, one of the other one of the other arms or ideas of Gnosticism was the ascetic approach. The licentious one seems to be the one that Peter is most addressing because he keeps talking about immorality and some of those kinds of things. But the ascetic approach was the approach that says the body is evil, the spirit is good, but we're trapped inside this evil body, so we've got to do everything we can to punish this evil body and make it suffer and bring it under control. And so they took Paul's concepts of buffeting their body literally, and they would literally whip themselves in some cases, or starve themselves, or do things to make their body suffer so that they could get away from them. And of course, that's the same mistake as the licentious ones. It's just coming from a different direction. It's the mistake of saying the flesh is what controls me, and I have to do some kind of physical thing to the flesh, or I have to give in to the physical desires of the flesh. And either one of those two somehow matters that much. Jesus says what makes a man sinful is what? Is it outside of him or what? It's what comes from inside of him, So beating yourself up, spiritually or physically, isn't really getting you any closer to God. It's what's coming from inside of you. So Paul goes on and says, but thanks be to God that though you were slaves to sin, you became obedient from the heart to the form of teaching to which you were committed, and having been freed from sin, you became slaves of righteousness. So there's not really an in-between option. That's the thing that a lot of our teachers today, I don't mean in the church, I mean in the world, would like us to believe. That there's an option in the middle there. That you can be a slave to sin, you can be a slave to righteousness, or you can be your own man. You can do your own thing, go your own way. And whether we put that in terms of something like, embracing the Spirit and being guided by your inner truth, or whether we put that in terms of secular humanism, I don't really believe in God, but I believe that we should be nice to each other and do good things. There's a lot of different ways we couch that. But at the end of the day, it's all just a way of dressing up, saying, I'm going to do what I want to do. And we're going to call it what we want to, but at the end of the day, I'm going to do what I want to do, and I'm not going to be bound by your rules or your limitations or what somebody else tells me to do. And again, this is a particular challenge when it comes to this country, because we are so tied up in this idea that it's our right to do whatever we want to do. And we are part of a nation that is built on the idea that when government isn't the way that you feel like it should be, you can get rid of that government. And I don't keep coming back to that because I think there's something bad about our country. That's not my point. My point is that when that's part of your ethos as a nation, it does tend to breed people who think, I don't like rules and rules are bad. But the truth is that rules are by and large a good thing. And structure is by and large a good thing because it helps to keep us safe. I was teaching an enrichment class. It's a shorter version of it's a class that's kind of for fun or for education in the middle of the day. Lasts about 35 minutes, and the class I've been teaching is called Rules to Live By. And one of the things we talk about is being a nation of laws and why that makes sense. And I asked the kids, what's the purpose? Why do we have speed limits? What do you guys think? Why do we have speed limits?
Hand out tickets.
Because and there's always some smart mouth who says, yeah, they hand out tickets. But what's the real reason why we have speed limits? Safety. Can you imagine if we didn't have any speed limit on 87, how terrifying it would be whenever there were any of the teenagers that live in this community driving up and down 87? I mean, they'd be going as fast as they could, and it would be incredibly dangerous to all the people around them because of the fact that you're driving a 2 or 3 ton hunk of metal and steel, metal and glass and fiberglass. It's just not safe. Now you want the relationship between the speed limit and the safety to make sense, but there's definitely a reason for it.
Whenever I was in high school, I took an engineering class, and the civil engineers, sorry, not civic, the civil engineers, whenever they design the roads, there's actually a math equation that goes into, so like we think about Corvair curve headed down into Phoenix. You got to figure out how many G's you're going to be pulling if you go a certain speed, what the average person can do around that. In town, how long it takes for something to stop, which is why most residential areas are 25, if not less.
Right.
So there's quite a bit of calculation that goes
Right.
into it. It's not just to be nice.
There's a thinking process. Now, what's interesting is when you think about this, and I can remember this back when I was a teenager, the reputation that Globe had. Globe had this reputation. It wasn't that their speed limits or their rules about traffic were wrong or bad. It was the enforcement of them was very much directed towards maximizing revenue. And so that's where we see where the idea of having a structure or laws can be good and yet be applied in a way that's bad. When you have police officers who are literally looking for the most minor infraction to write you a ticket, then you have a problem. Then you have a Pharisee, basically, who's running your traffic system. And so that distinction between exercising judgment and recognizing that the reason for this is safety, and ignoring judgment and saying this is all about making money and getting my quota, that's a very different mindset. But when we think about righteousness and we think about the rules of righteousness, we have to recognize that those rules exist for our safety, for our betterment, not because God enjoys making us do things that we don't want to do, or not letting us do things that we do want to do. But when you look at the harm that's done by ignoring the rules of righteousness in people's lives, to people around us, when you look at the struggle that we have if we are constantly living at odds with what our inner self says we should be doing, you start to see why the world isn't really having as much fun as it looks like they are. You know, I think about the people. I used to work with this guy when I was working as an intern at Motorola in the summers, and I have never met a person who was a more like obvious dichotomy in my entire life, because at work he was an incredibly disciplined thinker. He was a programmer. He was a programmer, but he was an engineer. And he had in his cubicle, he had just all of the walls of his cubicle, except the one that his desk was on, were just one after another notebooks of like the big 3-ring binder notebooks filled with code that he had written. And if you had questions about something about how one of the integrated circuits we were working on was working, he could literally, without even having to hardly look at it, he could just reach over, pull out the book where that was, and he could pull it out and figure out what was going on in the code. He was very, very organized and disciplined at work. And then he went home, and he was, particularly on the weekends, every weekend he came back with another story about just how wasted he got that previous weekend. And his favorite story, he would take a couple of days off around his birthday, along with the weekend, so either leading into or after the weekend. And he had what he called the annual beer invitational. And he got his friends together, and they would go golfing, and they would go in fours, and the scramble rules, whoever's got the best shot wins. And basically the way it worked is that your team, your score was based on how well you shot the ball and also how many beers you had as a team. So the more beers you had, the lower your score was. And basically the idea was you get one player who's really good and 3 players who are really good at drinking. And then and he talked about how the things that happened in this thing, and finally they actually got kicked out of the golf course because of what they were doing. And then the thing is, he made that work up to a point, but that starts to bleed over. You can't do stuff like that and not have it start to impact you. If nothing else, science tells us that he was killing a lot of brain cells that he was going to need later on, as much as he was drinking on the weekends and stuff like that. And so we look at people like that, we go, I can do that. But the truth is, most of us can't do it even as well as he did, and for the long term, nobody can do that. When you're living a life that is contradictory, when you're living a life where you're trying to cover up secrets, when you're living a life where you want to present yourself one way to one group of people and a different way to another group of people, inevitably, those things start to bleed over. And even if they don't, you are constantly at stress within yourself. because you're having to keep those secrets, and because you're having to keep straight who I am here versus who I am here, how I talk here versus how I talk there. And that dichotomy, that internal conflict, is something that creates an incredible struggle for us. Because one way or the other, we're struggling against the chains on us, whether it's the chains of obedience to sin or whether it's the chains of obedience to righteousness. When we're trying to sin, either way, we're not happy. But with Christ, when you commit yourself fully to that and you turn that over to Him, you don't have to worry about a dichotomy between who you are and what you say you are. It's always the same. It's never something to be afraid of.
Through all that we've talked about today, I think, and one verse that I think really sums up a lot of the New Testament is the one we talked about with the yoke being easy and the burden light. And I think about what we've talked about and how true that is. Even the most introverted individual affects, I think, what was it, 50 people in their lifetime or something like that, which is a lot whenever you think about somebody who doesn't ever want to leave their house. And then thinking about who you choose, you're always partnered with somebody. Even if you were the smartest person on the face of the planet, you're still not the smartest person on the face of the planet, right? There's always somebody who's better at something that you're not. And I think about homeschooling and Henley and her math, which has been beyond a struggle this year. I joke about how it's been my tombstone's going to read a calculated death. Because some days are just so strong. But I've got the tips, I've got the tricks, I've got the knowledge, and she still refuses to listen. She wants to do it her way until she is so exhausted, so frustrated, angry, and then finally she does it a quick, easy way, whether it's using counters, whether it's a trick that I've taught her, whatever it is. And had she just relied on me at the very beginning of the day instead of 4 hours later, then we probably would have been done in 20 minutes, right?
Right.
And so to have that option of Jesus saying, I will carry the majority of your burden. I know the tips and tricks to get to heaven. All you have to do is listen to me. And that makes your burden light. You still have to make choices, but it's so easy on those choices. You just have to put in a little bit of the work. And we, a lot of times, refuse to do that, especially if we're coming out of a worldly thing. Or we rely on the people who are in her same age group. I love it whenever Remington tries to help her, right? No, thank you. So thinking about that, you have to be partnered with somebody.
Yeah.
At least make a good choice. And then you won't be struggling and
Yeah.
beating your head against the wall and dealing with this.
Yeah.
Dedicate yourself.
All right, that is a really good place to stop. That is a really good way, I think, of kind of wrapping this up. So next week we'll go back into 2 Peter a little bit and then look at some more expansion of that idea as well. So thank you guys for your participation.